All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back for another Boca Podcast episode. I'm here with a brand new guest, Misha Wynn. Misha, thank you so much for hanging out with me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I've been looking forward to this day for so long.
Well, and I have to say, we were talking about, energy and conversation before we hit the record button, but you bring a really great energy, which just naturally makes me excited for the conversation. And I think it's a really great reminder in general, and I'd love your thoughts on this. Like when we engage with clients, and in fact, my first question for you is about client experience. When we have a conversation with a client, whether it's through text or on the phone or in person, I think that bringing a really positive, kind of excited, certainly kind energy to that conversation is really important for making a great first impression, don't you?
Yeah, it is. It is. They want to know that you're excited about working with them.
Yeah.
So yes, it is very important. It's very important to do. And I'm an introvert, but I still have to give off that sort of energy, that excited energy every time I work with someone and talk with someone.
And that's fascinating to me. And I'm glad that you make that point. So, I mean, an introvert kind of stereotypically, at least in our culture these days, we talk about this concept of being an introvert and how, being in large groups of people or maybe having conversations with somebody we don't know can be draining emotionally or otherwise. But despite the fact that you categorize yourself as an introvert, you're still communicating a really great energy with me. We've never had the opportunity to have any kind of extensive conversation before, but you're bringing a great energy despite that, which I think highlights something really important. And I'm glad that we're following this tangent, by the way, which is that despite whatever tendencies we have, we still have the ability as individuals, as human beings, to make a choice to step beyond that, to step outside that little box that we've created for ourselves and choose to engage with somebody, in this case, in a way that we want to. So if we, despite feeling like we're introverts, we want to bring a higher energy to the conversation, we can choose to do that. We can learn how to do that. And I'm glad that you highlight that very point.
Yeah, it's something that I've learned to do, and it's something that I'm very cautious about because my energy affects the person's energy.
Yeah.
So my energy affects the audience's energy. So if you bring a great energy, you will get that back most times.
Oh, and that sums it up beautifully. We'll leave that for now, but I'm so glad that you highlighted it. But let's actually jump to that first question about client experience, customer experience. Is there a particular principle that has enabled you to bring a really great client experience to your clients?
Yes, and it goes along with what we were just talking about. So for me, it's being authentic and honest, communicating effectively, and showing gratitude. So people love to feel like they're wanted, like you're appreciative.
Yes.
And they want to feel that you're important. So that's something that we try to do in meetings. And that's something that I try to do on wedding days and in each photo session.
I'm really glad that you highlight this idea of being, and really, I mean, you could be a great interview. You've already made some great points, and we're barely even into the conversation. You're a great conversationalist, but I'm glad that you also highlight the importance of making somebody else feel important or significant. And it reminds me of something that I was actually just discussing in a recent podcast interview about Tony Robbins. Tony Robbins talks about human needs. I think he says that there are 6 human or basic human needs, and one of those is significance, right? We want to feel significant in some way. And if we go into a conversation trying to create that environment for the person that we're engaging with, clients or otherwise, especially in relationships, closer, more intimate relationships in particular, if we make that a focus, it's amazing how good we can make the other person feel. And as a result, the interaction in general becomes that much more positive.
That's true. And it's interesting that we're talking about this because this is the basis of a lot of my points in my business strategy.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to have an interesting opportunity to kind of expound on that here in just a little bit. It also reminds me of, there's that kind of stereotypical picture that we paint. If any of us have or have had dogs as pets, so you think about when you anytime you get home, that dog comes running to the door, or comes running to you, or maybe if you're going out to the backyard to meet it, comes running at you, all excited to see you. Despite the fact that might be a stereotype, I think there's something to be learned there, which is think about how good it makes us feel to be greeted like that by a pet. How much more incredible if we could bring that to our relationships and create that feeling of significance for the person on the other side of the conversation. I love that you highlight that. But one other question for you. You mentioned the word authentic. You try to bring authenticity to that interaction. That's kind of a catchphrase or a word rather these days. It's become almost cliche. And I feel like in some ways it's kind of the meaning of it gets watered down. I'd love for you to explain what that means to you.
Okay, so what that means to me is, like I said before, I'm naturally an introvert. So instead of trying to be someone that I'm not, I have to own myself, my
Sure.
strength, my weaknesses, and be true to myself. And that's first.
Okay.
And then I can work with others and be honest and helpful with others. So, when I go out for a shoot, I primarily shoot weddings. So when I go out to a wedding, I go out and I give a compliment. I help the bride with her wedding dress. We're helpful. We give suggestions. We're laughing with the family. And the goal is to really just be in the presence and be in the moment. I'm not really thinking about getting a award-winning shot. Of course, we all want those. It's more about the couple versus getting our award-winning shot. It's more about giving them what they need and really being there in their moment and cherishing their day with them and cherishing that moment with them.
Yeah, the word service comes to mind, and I'm glad because this is a theme that's been pretty consistent on the podcast. We've been talking about the importance of service in the context of our industry. The idea of serving is in some ways has had in the past negative connotation. I come from a pretty strict religious background, and so in some ways it has some religious connotation to me. But the reality is the idea of service, we're really just simply talking about focusing on the other person. What can we do to add value to their life? And particularly in the context of a wedding, how can I make their wedding day better by my presence, via my presence as a photographer? The focus is on the client. It's not about us. And I like that. I like that that's important to you and to your brand. And I'm sure it translates to the client and the experience that they're having.
Yeah, I definitely hope so. I really hope so. We really engage. We're not just there to work. We really try to engage when we're there, and we really try to have fun amongst ourselves, amongst me and the team,
Yeah.
and the couple, and with the family. A lot of times I feel like I leave and I have new family members, or
Yes.
usually I meet someone,
Yeah.
and I love that. I love being able to provide that. I think it takes so much stress away from the day, and it helps to calm the nerves.
That's
So
wonderful.
yeah.
I think back in my wedding photography career, and one of the things I'm still amazed by is the fact that families would allow us into their day, such an intimate day, the way that they did. They just kind of open up and, like you're saying, treat us like we were even family. I still count that a privilege, and it's a really incredible privilege that wedding photographers have in that very unique context. And so I love, you've created this very positive image of the day. Your focus is on serving the clients. I can imagine that, we talked about energy earlier. I can imagine the energy that you bring to that day really translates to creating an incredible client experience. And it's a great reminder for all of us. But I want to transition to the next question. And this has to do with brand position. Now, your business name is quite interesting in that it seems to allude to what your brand position might be. I'd love for you to expound on this, but your business name is Lavishly Luxe, and that's actually the website for everybody listening in. If you go to lavishlylux, lux.com, we'll link to that in the show notes. You can see Misha's website there. And by the way, the Instagram handle is Lavishly Luxe Studio, and you can check that out as well. But will you share what your brand position is, Misha? And for those of you listening in aren't familiar with this term or this phrase, brand position very simply is the UVP, the unique value proposition your business offers in your market.
Yeah. So, I think there's two different dynamics here for me when it comes to my brand position. One is Lavishly Luxe. Yes, I love anything lavish, of course. Who doesn't? So, a lot of times I like looking at these fashion magazines and these amazing poses, and you see these GQ magazines, and you want to photograph these models and all that, but everyone's not like that. Everyone doesn't look like that.
Sure.
So the one thing that is very important is that it's for the couples to feel very comfortable. And I notice once they are comfortable, then I feel that the images come off a little bit more authentic, and they come off a little bit more genuine, and it's true to them. So you can honestly look at that image and see that emotion. So, I do pose, but then I also allow them to kind of move to whatever's a little bit comfortable for them, so that I can get some actual great images, but they're also genuine, so that they don't feel that they're standing in these really awkward positions and it's just, it's really uncomfortable. I want them
Sure.
to feel very comfortable. So in my opinion, a lot of my best images are genuine, authentic, and candid moments. And so, the other part of that is artistic journalism and then candid, being candid. So for me, that means being relatable, being authentic, fitting into the space. So when you think of photojournalism, you think of going out, actually fitting into the community, fitting into the area or whatever it is that you're photographing,
Yeah.
so that you can get those raw, true, and great images. And so that's the idea that I take on into every wedding. I'm not necessarily focused on, again, getting this award-winning shot. I'm focused on really capturing that day as it unfolds and capturing the emotion.
Yeah,
So
I realize that you mentioned journalism or photojournalism, and this is a word that actually used to be really popular in our industry. I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 years ago. It was kind of it was the thing to do. It was the thing to be as a wedding photographer, be a photojournalist, and capture the moment as it happens. And it's interesting how we've moved away from that, largely for the sake, I think, of creating these, high fashion, really fancy posed images. And so there's an interesting opportunity as photography brands to kind of get back to that and even emphasize that, focus on that, make it some part of the brand position. So it's interesting you bring this up. But I am curious, though, how do you simultaneously manage or juggle that position while also communicating? I mean, or I guess playing on the name of your business, which has to do with being lavish. How do you make those two things coexist?
well, the majority of the couples that I get are, very fun couples, forward-thinking couples. And so the way that I market and I advertise, I place myself in places to where that I can attract those couples
Okay.
that love our work, and, we love them. So I have a very non-traditional way of advertising. A lot of times we'll go to, maybe we're at the women's brunch or the women's march, or we're at, some of these places that will attract the type of couple that actually like our work. And so one of my favorite images, the bride, she was an influencer and she just loved posing. And so the best image was just a pose. She just happened to be sitting there in that one spot, and I shot it. And we were done with the shoot, and
Yeah.
it was one of the best images. So I think when couples come and they see my work, they say, you know what, that's me. I like that. I love that. That's who I am. And so it makes it a little bit easier versus me trying to pose someone who doesn't really like to be post like that, or who doesn't like my images. So I try to go after those who honestly like my work.
It does make sense. I mean, when you share the work that you ultimately want to focus on capturing, right? If your portfolio, whether it's your website or your Instagram feed or otherwise, if you consistently post the type of images that you prefer to photograph, then naturally that's going to draw in clients that are relevant to that particular style. And then, you speak to the significance of being aware of the moment. And in that particular instance, you saw that opportunity, you captured that, and it turns into a beautiful image. And that's so, so important, that awareness, that constant awareness as more of a photojournalistic style wedding photographer. It's important to be aware. So, and really as photographers in general, I think we can continue to learn to be aware of our surroundings, and certainly the subjects in front of us. It's an art or an exercise that we have to continue to practice, but it'll certainly make us all better photographers at the end of the day. So that's a good reminder as well. But let me keep going. Let's talk about free time because this is honestly one of the main focuses of this podcast in general, was focusing on efficiency for the sake of more freedom and flexibility as business owners. Is there a particular workflow tip, technique, principle, idea that you can share that's enabled you to have a little bit of time in your life personally, to make time for the important people in your life, and ultimately even focus on things that will actually grow your business?
Yes. So I am a mother, and so I have twin boys, and so they keep me busy. One thing that I've learned to do is schedule intentional breaks. So I will schedule maybe 1 to 2 weeks, depending on my workload. That may be something that I do 2 or 3 times a year, and I schedule intentional breaks, and I force myself to do nothing. And so I make sure that my admin and the rest of my team have information, and they know what to do, so that I
Yeah.
can kind of just have a complete downtime. So that means no phone calls, no emails. I have to force myself to do that.
When you say force yourself, is that because you just tend to be a person that wants to be moving and doing all the time?
Yes. Yes, I have to do something. I have to move. I have to check my email. I have to check social media. I have to do something. So I have to force myself. That is one of the hardest things to do, is to force myself to do nothing and to be present at home.
Yeah, no, it really can be.
My family.
Yeah, that can be very difficult. So it's interesting, but you're being intentional, which is really important. This has also been a word that's been kind of a theme as of late on the podcast. Be intentional, create the space, and what you're doing for yourself there is certainly healthy emotionally, physically, psychologically, and it helps minimize burnout in the long run. Encourages creativity too, because if you come back to photographing fresh, what you're going to be able to bring to your client is going to be better that way. That's really important. Now, you said you do this how often again?
2 to 3 times a year.
Okay. And
so I may have a week or two
that
I'm completely off. And also I will shut the computer off, and at 10 o'clock, I will not respond to any emails, text messages, or anything after 10 o'clock, because I do have a habit of working pretty late and staying up. So that's also helpful.
Yeah, that's important. And wow, 10 o'clock. I mean, that's actually pretty late too, but you're right. I think a lot of photographers have a tendency, just because it's there, the computer, the phone, or both, they're there, they're available. You have easy access to them. It's easy to continue to work. And I know with maybe a few exceptions, for all of us, that potentially means burnout much quicker, a lack of creativity. And we as a result as well, also kind of bring less to our personal relationships, because of course we all have lives outside of our businesses, or at least I hope we do. And what we then bring to those personal relationships is going to be less as well. We have to keep that in mind for the sake of the important people in our life. So these are good reminders again. You mentioned the importance of delegating to your team, especially when you're taking time off. And I want to ask you about this idea of delegation or outsourcing in your business. You mentioned somebody who oversees admin work. Is that something that someone that you've had in place for a while? And do you delegate in any other way?
You know what? I have had an admin for a little while. That was one of the hardest things to let go of. And also editing. Majority of the editing is outsourced. And for me, the key to that was finding someone who could do it better than I can. So that made it a little bit easier for me to let it go.
That makes sense.
And I also started with one task at a time, because it's really hard to let go when you're a creative person, and when you're an entrepreneur, it's hard to let go. So I started with one task, and once I could trust someone with that one task, then it became 2 tasks, and then I was able to work up to it. So I'm a little bit better at delegating now, but I know it can be a challenge.
All right. Sorry about that, Boca Podcast listeners. We were having a little bit of a technical difficulty. You probably heard some of that buzzing in the background. So we've gone to a little bit different mode. Misha's still here with us, and we're going to keep going in the conversation, just flex and flow, and make this thing happen. So Misha, I want to keep going in our discussion here, moving on to a question about inspiration. This is a new question this year in the 2020 season of the Boca Podcast. Whereabouts do you find inspiration, encouragement, maybe a source of creativity outside of the photography industry?
I love art. I love all forms of art. I actually studied architecture in school. So, I love perspective. I love scale. I love all of that. And that's helped me in my business. So I'd say that's the biggest inspiration for me. And also, every weekend as I'm capturing new love stories, it does remind me of my mother, who has Alzheimer's, and love is just very timeless for me, and it's very important. And even though she's in a very advanced stage of Alzheimer's, she can still show love. When I see her, she still greets me and gives me a hug and gives me a kiss and all that. So I really understand how timeless love is, and I love celebrating it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, and I mean, that relationship you just spoke of largely speaks for itself. I mean, again, to that idea of service, but then focusing on, I guess, ultimately making the best of or taking advantage of the moments that you do have together with her is it's so important, and it's a great reminder for all of us. And being able to take that to your interaction with your clients, also a wonderful thing. When you talk about art, though, and I guess maybe what would the sources of those inspiration be specifically in the realms of art? I mean, do you have coffee table books that you're looking at? Are you going to museums? Are you looking at some things online? How do you go about finding inspiration in that art?
Well, I love going to museums. I love sculpture mainly.
Yeah.
So I love trying different museums, going to different museums, just looking at different forms of art. I don't really have a favorite, so I'm pretty open to any form. So I just love the expression, personal expression.
That's lovely. Talk to me about, speaking of inspiration, another source of inspiration, books. Is there a particular business or self-help book that you've found inspiration or encouragement or really helpful information in the last few years?
Yeah, and I don't really read a lot of photography books.
Okay.
I do listen to podcasts, but I don't read a lot of photography books. Personally, one of my favorites, and it's been out for a while, is Reposition Yourself, Living Life Without Limits, and it's written by Pastor T.D. Jakes.
Okay.
And it's really about repositioning your life. I mean, positive things happen in life, negative things happen, and it's so easy to lose who you are and lose your focus and lose your direction. And it's just about placing yourself in a better place and moving forward. No matter what happens, just continuing to move forward.
Yeah, that idea of proactivity is so important. I mean, even, of course, this is a very tiny example, but we were dealing with some technical audio issues, and it would be easy in the moment maybe just to get totally stressed out and flustered and be like, oh, we'll just do this another time. But instead, you just flex and flow and you figure out how to move beyond that thing and keep moving forward. Again, that's a very small example, but I think it's a good reminder for our personal lives and our professional lives that we learn how to be that way. We learn how to flex and flow, continue to move forward, focus on being proactive versus just kind of reacting and letting things get to us too much.
Right. And one thing that he talks about is selling yourself for less than what you deserve. And that's an example that we can use in our personal lives and, in business. And sometimes when you're not feeling too confident, you had a bad experience, you tend to sell yourself for less than what you really deserve. And it's about, accepting those mistakes and moving forward and owning it and learning and, placing yourself in a better situation.
It's a great reminder for all of us. And of course, we'll link to that book in the show notes. If you go to bokehpodcast.com, we'll link to that probably on Amazon actually for everybody. We've also created a resource actually for anybody who doesn't know about this yet. If you go to Boca, and I'm going to double check here and make sure I'm telling everybody the right thing because I actually started to second guess myself. But if you go to bokehbookshelf.com, this is a resource that Haley recently created, highlighting the most popular books on the podcast that our guests have mentioned. So you can take advantage of that resource there too if you're also looking for books to read or to listen to. And so check that out, bokehbookshelf.com. But let's jump to our primary point of conversation for today, Misha. And this has to do with finding the perfect second shooter. And this is an interesting one. Honestly, I mean, shooting weddings for over 10 years, I rarely had a so-called second shooter. I photographed with my partner, and she was a second photographer. So we were, each person, I guess, was just as important as the other. Many times with second shooters, we're bringing a person along to either be an assistant in some way and or then also get additional pictures where we can't. Can you, first of all, just kind of give context to the idea of a second shooter? Does the definition vary from event to event, or how do you see it?
It can vary from event to event. Most of the time when I have a second shooter, we are pretty much equal. It's not just someone that, is just catching a few images. Our images are equally as important. So for me, a few of the most important reasons to have a second shooter is to catch images from different angles and also to allow you to capture more detail. And then a second shooter can help when things go wrong, when you lose or your equipment breaks. That's one important reason to have a second shooter. And the other thing is the second shooter can help with the groom, photos of the groom while I'm with the bride. And so for me, those are the reasons to have a second shooter.
Yeah, almost like an extension of you as the photographer, being where you can't be, also acting as a backup. And these are really important reasons to keep in mind, and especially for maybe a studio that hasn't really considered the idea before. Our industry talks about the idea of second shooters a lot, but maybe many photographers will say, you know what, I'm good enough on my own. I got it covered. I can handle this. But there are pretty significant benefits to working with a second photographer, and you highlighted a number of them there. Of course, we'll put that in the show notes as well at bokehpodcast.com for anybody that's curious. But when we're trying to find a second shooter, I mean, somebody who is reliable, who's going to show up, who's going to be there on time, who's going to follow instructions and ultimately represent our brand well. I don't.
That's really important.
It's really important, yeah, and it can ultimately be maybe a bit of a challenge to find that person that's a best fit for our company. Have you had some bad experiences trying to find and then work with second shooters?
Yes, I have. Two that I can think of right off. One, I had a second shooter that was a little argumentative, and he actually got into a really heated argument with one of the guests at the wedding. And it was very distracting. And so that is something that was somewhat of an embarrassment to me.
Yeah.
And definitely not something that I would like to experience again. And the other thing was I had someone who I really didn't like their images. So I felt that the gallery of images or the portfolio that I saw didn't look nothing like the images that I received that night. So those are two bad experiences that I had. And so I try to do my best to avoid those two things from happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and let's kind of focus on that for just a second. Reasons why it can be difficult to find a second shooter that's reliable, that is a good representative for our brand. I mean, you mentioned a couple there. One, it's hard to know, after maybe a few interactions, what this person's personality is at a bigger picture level, how they're going to interact with guests, how they're going to respond to a stressful situation. So that can be one of the reasons, I guess. The other that you mentioned too is it's easy to show a few pictures, 10, 20, 50, 100 pictures that look good. But again, on a larger scale, can they actually produce? Can they show up and rep your brand really well? That might be another reason why it's difficult to find a second shooter. Are there some other reasons as well?
Yeah, find someone who is a personality fit. Who can come in and work very well with the team. That can be a little hard to find. It can be a challenge to find someone who can fit your shooting style. So for me, I think that's the biggest challenge that I run into. And of course, you want someone who's trustworthy, that's going to be on time, like you said, and someone who has enough wedding experience for me to know exactly what to do. Because most weddings are, we have a timeline, but something always happens. Something is not on the timeline, something comes up. And so you want to make sure that you have someone who can easily just follow along and still capture images, someone who's experienced enough to be able to capture the type of images that you want them to capture.
Yeah, that's interesting too, because, in many cases, probably the more experienced photographers are likely already running their own businesses. So trying to get them to second shoot for you might be a bit of a challenge. But let's get right to the kind of meat of this conversation, which is how to go about finding we're going to make it proactive, right? There may have been some negative experiences, but ultimately we need to figure out certain specific ways to go about finding a good second shooter. And I'd love to know from your experience, if there are some tips that you have for our listeners about how to go about finding that second shooter and minimizing the possibility of running into those kind of horror stories, if you will.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So finding someone eager to learn and work. You don't want to hire someone who's just going to kind of sit around that you have to micromanage. Yes. Someone who's eager to learn, to work, who doesn't mind asking questions. That is something big for me. No one knows everything, so that's a big one. I will share a gallery of my images so that they know what to expect. So they know what the expectation is, okay, I should say. So they know what type of images I want to capture and I'm looking to capture. And so before I bring someone on as a second shooter, I will allow them to come in and shadow so they can understand exactly how we work and exactly how we move throughout the day. That has been very helpful, because when you're working with someone, it's hard for me to bring someone in that I've never worked with for a wedding and I have no expectation. They don't have an expectation. So it's really good to set expectations. So after shadowing, we'll sit down, go over the images, and we'll discuss expectations and what could be different, ways that we can improve. And then after that, I will hire them as an assistant to come work along with me and a second photographer, and just to see if they're a fit. So that's a process that I use, and that's been very helpful with choosing who I then hire as a second photographer.
That's interesting. Okay, that last point, and I want to kind of go back over each of these points, but that last point that you made is quite interesting to me. So you'll have this new second shooter come along with another second photographer, so that I'm assuming that's just so you don't risk only having one shooter there who's not experienced and who could potentially rep the brand poorly. You've got almost like a backup.
Yeah. So they're working as an assistant more so versus a second shooter. Yeah.
That's really smart. Okay, so I'm going to kind of backtrack though for a second. So I love the first point that you made, which is the importance of finding somebody who is eager to learn and to work both. And you mentioned the significance of curiosity. The interesting thing about curiosity, I mean, this is a life lesson really, but curiosity almost in a sense kind of removes ego, right? Ego says, I know it all. I've got it figured out. You don't need to tell me anything. How dare you question this thing or suggest that I didn't do this right or otherwise. Curiosity suggests that I think a lot of that ego is set aside because you're genuinely interested in how something works and you're genuinely interested in figuring something out. You're interested in what the other person has to say. I think this is a really great personality trait, curiosity. Is there a way that you are able to gauge that person's curiosity and ultimately their eagerness to learn from you?
Yeah, so when we sit down for a meeting, usually I will meet with someone first face to face, and we'll just have a candid conversation. And a lot of times I can tell by just that conversation if they're a know-it-all, if they feel like, they've got everything figured out, or if they're eager to learn how I work. So, and that's something I can gauge when I sit down and I talk to someone. A lot of times someone who's really eager to work and learn, they're going to ask, well, what would you like for me to do? Or how can I improve? Or what will be more helpful to you? And so that kind of tells you a little bit about someone's character trait. Again, I do want someone, when we go in for a wedding day, I want them to, serve the client.
Yes.
So that's kind of like a pre-interview.
That totally makes sense, but that's so important, and I think something that can't be emphasized enough. Before even the photographic skills are addressed, make sure that the attitude, the mentality is right. And in this case, we're talking about the importance of eagerness, I guess, ultimately to learn, a curiosity, and then ultimately a motivation to serve, or just to sum it up, to say that somebody is eager to work. But really, it's focused on serving the client. I'm glad that you highlight that as well. So that's a great first point. The second one, you talked about sharing a gallery of images with this potential second shooter and creating expectations around the style of photography that you want from them. How detailed do you get with this? I mean, are you looking at like technical settings of the camera? Are you looking just simply at composition? What does this process look like?
I'm looking more for composition. So I show them a gallery of a wedding or a couple of weddings, and I go through images and say, this is one image that I like. I love this image, and this is why I love it. And this is what we're looking to capture.
Okay.
So for me, a lot of it is composition, because I can kind of teach someone's photography skills and we can adjust settings, but the composition and knowing what to catch and when to catch it is something that's a little harder to teach. So it's best for me to show that.
That totally makes sense. Yeah. And that's a great point too. You're right. I mean, especially with the cameras these days, if absolutely necessary, those cameras can go into aperture priority or some automatic mode that will likely nail the exposure the majority of the time, but the composition can't be redone, especially if you have to crop significantly. So highlighting the significance of composition is a really interesting point of conversation. And then you take them to the third point, which is shadowing you on a wedding. What does that look like? Are they there literally for the whole day with you and just following you around? And are they doing so? You alluded to reviewing the images after, so they've got a camera with them. Are you expecting them to shoot all day long? What does this process look like of shadowing?
No, they don't have to stay all day. I do like for them to come for at least 2 or 3 hours. I prefer for them to come at least an hour before the wedding and kind of walk through the venue with me and see how I shoot some details and getting ready shots. So I do like for them to shoot And as they're shooting, I'll kind of look and we'll kind of talk about maybe what the settings can be. But not too much because it's kind of hard to slow down during wedding day. So I'll let them come along. And then I'll ask them to upload images. A lot of times I'll, edit their images, and then we will talk about the images afterward that they caught versus the ones that I caught.
Okay. Yeah. So they may come along for what, like 2, 3, 4 hours for that shadowing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's usually no more than 4 hours.
And then you mentioned, and this brings us to the fourth point, the importance of reviewing the images with them after the fact. You're going to go ahead and have those images edited or edit them yourself, and then you're going to look through them. What does that review process look like? What is some of that feedback that you might give? What does that sound like?
So I look at how close they are to the images that I've taken or the angles that I've taken, and then we talk about it. We talk about the composition, we talk about the lighting, we talk about whether this was a great image to catch or whether it wasn't a great image, and where I was, the positioning. We talk about pretty much every aspect of the image. Okay. And really going back to shadowing and talking about someone's character, during that shadowing process, I can tell usually if someone's really eager or if they're just kind of going to sit over against the wall and, go get the bar. So I can tell a lot by that. So when we go over the images, I can tell really between the shadowing and going over the images if that's someone that I would want to work with or not. But yeah, going over images, it's composition, it's lighting, placement. We pretty much talk about everything.
And how long would that review session last? Like an hour or two, or what does it look like?
About an hour. About an hour.
And will you give them another chance if it doesn't turn out great the first time? Will you give them another chance or 2 or 3 chances? Like at what point do you say, you know what, enough's enough. This is not a good fit. I'm going to look for somebody else.
Well, if personality wise, if it's not a fit, then I won't really go any further than that.
Sure.
Or if someone comes and they're really not helpful at all, then I won't go any further than that. But if the composition of the images is pretty good, then I can move forward with that.
Yeah, that makes sense, because if somebody is open to learning, they're eager to learn, they're open to your feedback, they're easy to work with in that sense, then, like you said, teaching some of the skill set, or more specifically, the style of composition, for example, that's something that can be done. I think that's really important too. And it's really a great reminder for all of us, including myself. We need to be teachable. We need to keep an open mind to feedback that we can get from somebody else, whether that's our employer or it's an associate or somebody in our personal lives somewhere. Being open to feedback, setting that ego aside, it's going to ultimately enable us to continue to grow as individuals, and that's certainly important for a second shooter. I'm really glad that you've highlighted that. The fifth point that you mentioned in this process of finding a good second shooter is then having that potential second shooter then come along on a wedding where you already have an actual second. They're coming along more as an assistant at that point. Can you describe in a little bit more detail what that looks like too? When you say they're an assistant, are they just carrying gear around? Are they also shooting on that day too, so you can review those images?
They will be shooting on that day, but they will help, like with the dress, or help us set up details, or help us set up light. I will, during that time, it's a time to teach, although I'm paying them. I will teach them how I use the lighting, what settings I use. So it's more teaching, in my opinion, so that hopefully the next time that person can work as a second shooter.
That makes sense.
And it's also getting familiar with, getting a little bit more familiar with me and the team that I work with.
Yeah, this is a really wonderfully balanced approach. It seems as though that you're taking, and it's interesting how this could apply to potentially bringing on associates of other kind, whether it's for administrative work or otherwise for our companies, for our listeners' companies. This is a really wonderful introduction to this process of bringing in somebody on board and making sure that they are a good fit. And it might be even something that I reference as an outline. This is great information, a great introduction to how to go about finding a second shooter. And I really appreciate you making time to share with me and with our listeners today as well. I want to make sure that you have the opportunity just to remind our listeners one more time where they can find you and follow you online. Of course, we'll put this in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com. But will you just remind us of your website and social media as well?
Yes, my website is lavishlylux.com. Instagram is lavishlylux studio. Facebook is lavishlylux. And I really want to thank you for this opportunity. It really meant the world to me to share my knowledge with your listeners.
Oh, and truly the privilege is mine. I love that you've become part of this Boca Podcast community. And everybody make sure that you give Misha a shout out, a follow, message her, and share with her what you learned from the conversation as well. You can see the show notes from today's conversation at Boca Podcast, BOKEHpodcast.com, or find the show notes in your favorite podcast app. And we look forward to not only continuing to have you listen in, but if you're interested in being a part of the podcast at all, you listeners out there, you want to come on board like Misha did today and add value to the community, or maybe you're interested in a brand position consultation. We've been pushing some of these out as of late. Don't hesitate to reach out. Just Nathan@photographersedit.com. Would love to hear from you. I hope everybody has an absolutely wonderful day. Thank you so much for listening to the Boca Podcast. Will you let us know what you thought by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast and suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Boca Podcast is brought to you by Milu, the simplest way for photographers and coordinators to collaborate on shot lists and timelines for weddings, parties, and other amazing events. Visit Milu, MIILU.com. This podcast is also brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the professional photographer. Visit photographersedit.com.